You believe you would never hurt an innocent person. You believe that if someone in a white lab coat told you to electrocute a stranger, you would refuse. You would stand up, say no, and walk out. But 65% of people, just like you, would not stop. They would keep pressing the button, they would listen to the screams. They would watch a man beg for his life, and they would keep going, not because they were evil, not because they were psychopaths, but because someone in authority told them to. Obedience kills morality. In 1961, a psychologist named Stanley Milgram designed an experiment so disturbing that it shook the foundations of everything we believed about human nature. What he discovered was not a flaw in a few broken individuals. It was a flaw in all of us, a terrifying capacity for blind obedience that lives inside every ordinary person. And today, we are going to walk through that experiment step by step, so you can understand exactly why it still haunts psychology to this day. The disappearance of a sense of responsibility is the most far-reaching consequence of submission to authority. What you are about to learn will change how you see yourself, how you see the people around you, and how you understand the darkest chapters of human history. Picture a clean, sterile laboratory at Yale University. A man in a gray lab coat greets you at the door. He explains that you have volunteered for a study on memory and learning. Simple enough. You are introduced to another participant, a friendly, middle-aged man with a warm smile. He is led into a separate room, strapped to a chair, and electrodes are attached to his arms. You are seated in front of a large machine covered in switches. Each switch is labeled with a voltage, starting at 15 volts and climbing all the way to 450. 15 to 450. The experimenter tells you that every time the other man answers a question incorrectly, you must flip the next switch. You must deliver an electric shock, and with each wrong answer, the voltage increases. You are told this is for science, and that the shocks are painful but not dangerous. You nod, you trust the man in the lab coat. After all, this is Yale. These are professionals. What could possibly go wrong? Everything could go wrong. But here is what you do not know. The man in the other room is not a real participant. He is an actor, and the shocks are not real. The only thing being tested is you. Now here is the detail that makes this experiment so terrifying. Milgram did not recruit soldiers. He did not recruit criminals or sadists or people with violent histories. He put out a simple newspaper advertisement in New Haven, Connecticut. He asked for ordinary volunteers from every walk of life. Teachers, accountants, engineers, salesmen, postal workers, fathers who coached Little League on weekends, men who went to church on Sunday mornings, men who loved their families and considered themselves decent, moral, good people. And before the experiment began, Milgram asked a panel of 40 psychiatrists to predict what would happen. These were trained experts in human behavior. Their prediction was unanimous. They believed that only 1% of participants, the most psychologically disturbed fraction, would go all the way to the maximum shock. 1% prediction. The rest, they said, would refuse early. They would listen to their conscience. They would walk away. As the great philosopher Hannah Arendt once observed, the sad truth is that most evil is done by people who never make up their minds to be good or evil. And that is precisely what Milgram was about to prove. The psychiatrists were not just wrong, they were catastrophically, devastatingly wrong, and what happened next would change psychology forever. The experiment begins. The first few wrong answers come and you press the switches. 15 volts, 30 volts, 45. You hear a slight grunt from the other room. Nothing too alarming, but then the voltage climbs. At 75 volts, the man groans audibly. At 120 volts, he shouts that the shocks are becoming painful. At 150 volts, he screams and demands to be released. Release me. He begs you to stop. He says he has a heart condition. He says he cannot take any more. You look at the experimenter. You say you want to stop. And the experimenter, calm and composed, simply says 4 phrases. 1, please continue. 2, the experiment requires that you continue. 3, it is absolutely essential that you continue. 4, you have no other choice, you must go on. No threats, no force, no weapon, just a calm voice and a white lab coat. And most people kept going. At 300 volts, the man pounds on the wall desperately. At 315 volts, he stops responding entirely. Complete silence. If this pattern is making your stomach turn right now, hit like and subscribe to keep exploring the depths of your psyche with me. Because what the results revealed is even more disturbing than what happened in that room. Here is the number that shattered everything. 65. 65% of participants went all the way to 450 volts, the maximum shock. The switch labeled with 3x marks and the words danger, severe shock. They heard the screams, they heard the begging, they heard the pounding on the wall, and then they heard silence, the most horrifying sound of all, because silence meant the man might be dead. And still, they pressed the button. Screams, silence, button pressed. Not 1%, as the psychiatrists predicted, 65%. 2 out of every 3 ordinary people obeyed, until the very end. They sweated, they trembled, they laughed nervously. Some of them cried, but they did not stop. As Milgram himself wrote, ordinary people, simply doing their jobs, and without any particular hostility on their part, can become agents in a terrible, destructive process. These were not monsters, they were you, they were your neighbors, they were the people sitting next to you on the train this morning. And the question that haunted Milgram, the question that should haunt all of us, is devastatingly simple. Why? What force is powerful enough to override a person's deepest moral convictions? Milgram spent years analyzing what happened in that room, and he arrived at a concept that explains not just his experiment, but some of the most horrifying events in human history. He called it the agentic state. When a person enters the agentic state, they stop seeing themselves as responsible for their own actions. They become an instrument of someone else's will. A tool, a vessel, not a decision maker, but an executor. Think about what that means. The participants did not believe the shocks were right. When interviewed afterward, many of them said they felt terrible. They knew it was wrong, they wanted to stop. But in that moment, sitting in front of that machine, they experienced a psychological shift. They stopped asking themselves what is the right thing to do. Instead, they asked, what does the authority want me to do? The self becomes chained to the command. Their sense of personal responsibility evaporated. They told themselves, it is not my fault. I am just following instructions. The man in the lab coat is in charge. If something goes wrong, it is on him. They outsourced their conscience to the nearest authority figure. And that is the most dangerous psychological mechanism ever documented. Because it means that under the right conditions, almost anyone can be made to do almost anything. But Milgram did not stop there. He ran dozens of variations of the experiment to understand exactly what made people obey, and what he found was chilling in its precision. When the experimenter left the room and gave instructions by telephone, obedience dropped to 20%. When 2 experimenters gave contradictory commands, almost no one continued. When the participant had to physically place the victim's hand on the shock plate, obedience dropped. But it did not disappear. Distance, uniform voice. 30% still obeyed, even when they had to touch the person they were hurting. 30% pressed a man's hand onto the plate and shocked him anyway. What these variations revealed is that obedience is not about fear or coercion. It is about perceived legitimacy. The lab coat, the prestigious university, the calm, confident tone. These are the ingredients that make an authority figure feel legitimate. As the philosopher Erich Fromm warned decades earlier, the danger of the past was that men became slaves. The danger of the future is that men may become robots. We do not obey because we are forced, but because we believe the authority has the right to command. And that belief, that invisible agreement, is what makes obedience so difficult to resist. It does not feel like submission. It feels like cooperation, and that is what makes it lethal. There is a reason Milgram designed this experiment in 1961. That year, the trial of Adolf Eichmann was broadcast around the world. Eichmann was one of the primary architects of the Holocaust, responsible for the logistics of transporting millions of people to their deaths. And when he stood trial in Jerusalem, the world expected to see a monster. Instead, they saw a bureaucrat, a quiet, ordinary man who repeatedly said the same thing. I was just following orders. I was doing my job. I was obeying my superiors. Hannah Arendt covered the trial and coined a phrase that would define the 20th century: the banality of evil. Evil, she argued, does not always come from hatred or malice. Sometimes it comes from thoughtlessness, from ordinary people who simply stop thinking for themselves. Milgram wanted to test whether Eichmann's defense could be true. Could ordinary Americans in a laboratory at Yale demonstrate the same capacity for blind obedience? Orders, obedience, banality. The answer was yes, and it was not a small yes. It was an overwhelming, undeniable yes. The same mechanism that fueled the Holocaust exists in every human being. Not as a cultural flaw, not as a national weakness, as a feature of human psychology itself. And that realization changes everything about how we must think about morality and responsibility. You might be thinking this was 1961. People were different then. We have evolved. We are more aware now. We would not fall for this, but you would be wrong. Replications of Milgram's experiment have been conducted across the world, and the results barely changed. In 2009, Jerry Berger replicated the study at Santa Clara University with modern ethical safeguards. The obedience rate was virtually identical. In Poland, in 2017, researchers found that 90% of participants were willing to deliver the highest shock level. 90%. The suit replaced the lab coat, but the obedience remained. Think about your own life. How many times have you done something at work that felt wrong, but you did it anyway because your boss told you to? How many times have you stayed silent when you should have spoken up because the person giving the orders seemed to know better? Obedience to authority is not a relic of the past, it is happening right now. Corporate orders silence comply. Every time you follow a policy you know is harmful, every time you enforce a rule you know is unjust, every time you tell yourself it is not my call, you are sitting in Milgram's chair, and you are pressing the button. So is there any hope? Can we actually resist the pull of authority when it asks us to do something wrong? Milgram's own data gives us the answer. Remember, 35% of participants did refuse. They stopped, they stood up and said no. And when Milgram studied what made these people different, he found something crucial. The ones who resisted were the ones who maintained their sense of personal responsibility. They refused to enter the agentic state. They kept asking themselves, is this right? Instead of asking, what does the authority want? 1. Question authority openly, not silently. 2. Maintain personal responsibility for your actions. 3. Remember that obedience is a choice, not a reflex. As the psychologist Philip Zimbardo, who conducted the Stanford prison experiment, later observed, heroes are ordinary people whose social actions are extraordinary. They act when others are passive. The difference between the 65% who obeyed and the 35% who refused was not intelligence. It was not education. It was not empathy. Awareness, responsibility, courage. It was the willingness to accept the discomfort of disobedience, to feel the social pressure and choose to resist it anyway, to say I am responsible for what I do, regardless of who is telling me to do it, and that is a skill. It is not an instinct. It is something you have to practice before you need it. Here is the part that most people do not want to hear. Every single participant who obeyed, every single person who pressed the button all the way to 450 volts, believed beforehand that they would never do it. They all thought they were good people. They all thought they would be the exception, just like you think right now. That is the lesson of Milgram. It is not about them. It is about you. It has always been about you. The capacity for blind obedience does not live in some dark corner of humanity that you are exempt from. It lives in the same brain that tells you to be polite, to follow the rules, to trust the experts, to do what you are told. The line between good and evil runs through the heart of every human being. As Alexander Solzhenitsyn wrote from the depths of the Soviet Gulag, the line separating good and evil passes not through states, nor between classes, but right through every human heart. Milgram did not discover that humans are evil. He discovered something far more unsettling. Obedience. He discovered that goodness requires effort, that morality is not a default setting. It is a decision you have to make actively every single day, especially when someone with authority tells you not to. The Milgram experiment is not just a chapter in a psychology textbook. It is a warning that the most dangerous force in human society is not hatred, not violence, not even ignorance. It is obedience without thought. Think, question, resist. 65% of ordinary people pressed a button that they believed was killing a stranger because a man in a lab coat told them to continue. And if you take nothing else from this, take this. The next time someone in a position of authority asks you to do something that feels wrong, remember those 65%. Remember that they were not monsters. They were people who forgot that they had a choice. You always have a choice, and the moment you forget that is the moment you become dangerous. If you made it this far, comment Volt 450 if you are ready to question authority and think for yourself. Welcome to the Psyche Project.